And if my soul is truly a non-material entity, then it could not have been created by the transigencies of materialistic evolution. It had to be created by a non-material, supra-intelligent consciousness. Who is this supra-intelligent consciousness? Traditionally, we call it God, or if you are from other religions, you might call it Allah, the Tao, the Brahma, or if you are a bit more trendy, you might call it the Force. May the Force be with you. And if this God does exist, does he have a plan for me? And what is his plan? So you can see, my friends, that suddenly all these questions become very important if the soul does indeed exist. Now, modern psychology or sociology will not address this. And you can see, my friends, that if the soul does indeed exist, which I am convinced it does, and I'm sure many of you here looking at me and listening to me are also convinced that it does, then what are its implications on the flourishing life? Now, in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle makes two claims about what the flourishing life or happiness is. Number one, he says that happiness is fundamentally the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, which means seeking that which is highest. Now, secondly, he also did say that happiness does include somewhat the needs of external goods, like we need family, we need friends, we need money, we need political power, we need some status, and all these are beneficial to us too. I presume it was because Aristotle firmly believed that we have a body and a soul that he said such things. As such, we do need external goods like wealth, friends, family, political power to have a comfortable and secure life. But in his mind, however, Aristotle believed that the highest happiness was the life of intellectual contemplation, which is fundamentally the activity of the soul. And this life of intellectual contemplation, my dear friends, is precisely asking all those questions that I just asked just now, if the soul does indeed exist. So from what I've shared with you, the human person is made up of a body, okay? If anybody has any doubts about that, you just go to him and pinch him, all right? And clearly you will know that, well, yeah, I am made up of cells, I'm made up of atoms and molecules. I hope I've also demonstrated to you that we are also a soul. Is that it? No, there is more. Now, I want to show you a little teaching aid, part of a Babushka doll, okay? Now, normally this darn doll has got 5 layers. I think the Japanese or the Russians originated, they originated from either Russia or Japan. But for my purposes, I will use a Babushka doll, which has only 3 layers. For the ancient Greeks, they said, yes, we do have a body, and this is the most evident part of who we are. You look at you, you can see the body. There's no denying that. But they also believe that within the body, well, there's a soul. So the body was soma, the soul was psyche. Okay. But they also believe that within each soul, there's a third part to who we are. Okay, a bit hard to hold 3 things at a time. Spiritus, a divine spark, a divine essence, So body, soul, spirit. This third part to who we are, I believe, is also quite central to our identity. Now, this inner divinity, the Greek philosophers called many names. Pythagoras called it the inner nous. Aristotle called it the inner logos. Socrates called it inner wisdom. Sometimes they would use a simple word called eudaimon, or good spirit within each person. They believed that this inner nous connected them to the greater nous, which was the supra-intelligent rationality that was the first cause of everything that existed. And that if they could only connect with this divine nous that was within them, then true knowledge and divine wisdom would break forth into their consciousness. Wow. Now, this idea of the Greek philosophers, that we had an inner divinity that was integral to who we are, okay, was not only something unique to to them. Interestingly, when you investigate the mystical traditions of all the great religions, you will find something similar. Hold on, I'll just. Okay. Buddhists call it the Buddha nature. Hindus call it the Atma. The true self is the divine self. Muslim Sufis call it the Ruh-e-Azam, the wisdom of Allah embedded in the soul, waiting to be discovered. Taoists call it the embryo of the cosmic Tao. Christians call it the kingdom of God within. The kingdom of God is where God is present. So in Mark's gospel, or is it Matthew's gospel, when Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you, that is the allegory that means that God is within each of us. Not just those of us who are baptized, but all. And that certainly a great part of life's purpose is to awaken to the divine wisdom and presence found within each person. The height of this divine awakening is called different things. It's called enlightenment by the Buddhists, self-realization by the Hindus, ascension by the Jews or Sufi mystics. Believe it or not, Christians call it theosis, the divinization of man, the ultimate inflowing of God's divine energies into us, where we become one with God. Wow. Did you know that? So, my friends, it would seem that the ultimate goal of life of every soul, and that is me, you, and every person on this planet, is the awakening of the divine within each of us. And that is ultimately the goal of every soul. That, it seems, is the end game of the flourishing life. Don't you think so? Now, I would like you to take some time to allow that to sink in. That the end game of the soul is ultimately oneness with the divine. So if we are indeed, body, soul, okay, and divine essence or spirit, as Paul says, we are body, soul, and spirit. In Latin, it is the soma, the psyche, and the spiritus. What implications does this have on our understanding of the flourishing life? It almost seems that human flourishing cannot solely be defined in terms of physical or material flourishing, like the utilitarians say it is. It has also to be seen, human flourishing, in terms of the flourishing of the soul and the awakening of the divine essence within each of us. Now, is there any corroboration from modern psychology to what I am saying? I believe there is. Let me elaborate. Now, psychology in the last 120 years history has had, for the most part, studied animal behavior and human behavior, but mostly around abnormal or maladaptive or dysfunctional behavior. By the 1960s, however, the human potential movement, spearheaded by psychologists like Abraham Maslow, Fritz Perls, Carl Rogers, and others, started to pay attention to what self-actualized states were like. And by the 1990s, psychologists started to focus on positive human qualities. What constitutes functional and successful human behavior? By the early 90s, authors like Stephen Covey, wrote his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Anthony Robbins was talking about awakening the giant within you, okay? Daniel Goleman was writing about emotional intelligence, or EQ. And all of these were looking at qualities, attitudes, skills, and behaviors that could help human beings to flourish. By the late 1990s, Martin Selligan, who earlier became famous for his research on learned helplessness and its relationship to depression. Martin Selligan is also considered to be the founder of the positive psychological movement that some of you might be familiar with. He began to emphasize that this understanding, oh dear. I'll just turn my phone off now. Sorry about that. He began to emphasize that this understanding and teaching of positive human qualities should be the main investigation of all psychological research. In other words, psychologists shouldn't be just studying about what makes human beings dysfunctional, but they should also be studying about what makes us flourish. And so it seems that studies on happiness seems to have started to mushroom over the last 20 years in particular. And why not? Since if I look at it, every one of our clients who come to see us is suffering or unhappy, isn't it? Clinicians felt that if they could only break down what happiness was, if they could only understand what we could do more of or less of to create and maintain happiness, then that would be very useful information. Don't you think so? All right. So by the early 2000s, universities all over the world started having centers for the study of happiness and well-being. Whether it was in Yale University, Harvard, Princeton, Cambridge, University of Tokyo in Asia, University of Singapore in Hong Kong, there was this vigor and determination in the study about happiness. Now, in the early stages of studying about happiness, researchers came across a problem. And that problem was about the subjective nature of happiness. Now you ask